According to a new report, experts say that we have until 2030 to avoid catastrophe. It also says if unprecedented changes are not made and made soon, there will be irreversible damage to the planet.
But limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will cost the globe more than $2 trillion between now and 2035.
We have a global emergency, and you use a phrase like that, and some people immediately say, okay, calm down, that can't be that bad, but it is.
Hello and welcome to the Great Climate Debate Podcast. My name is Jeffrey DeSena. The clips you just heard were recent responses to last week's release of the newest special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. There has been plenty of commentary on the report, some of it good, some of it not so much. Today, I would really like to focus on the responses, but in order to have a reasonable discussion about what those responses have been, I'm going to spend a little bit of time digging into what the report actually says, because there has been no shortage of hyperbole, mischaracterization, and oversimplification of the report. But first, who is the IPCC, and why are they such a big deal? Probably the most authoritative body on the subject of climate change is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. I make that claim based on the fact that it is certainly the largest and broadest body focused on amalgamating and publishing climate research. The IPCC is a cooperation of scientists from all UN member states and the World Meteorological Organization. Currently, there are 195 member states, basically all UN-recognized sovereign nations, including some that we Americans might not expect, like Cuba, North Korea, and China, but not Taiwan, for complicated political reasons. The IPCC was created in 1988, and its current mission is defined as follows. Quote, to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open, and transparent basis the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of risk of human-induced climate change, its potential impacts and options for adaptation and mitigation. IPCC reports should be neutral with respect to policy, although they may need to deal objectively with scientific, technical, and socioeconomic factors relevant to the application of particular policies. End quote. In fulfilling that mission, the IPCC has produced 5 semi-decadal assessment reports beginning in 1990, along with a host of other methodological reports and special reports. Last week, the hundreds of scientists who have come together to produce the most recent report met in Incheon, the port city just outside of the South Korean capital, Seoul. Who knows what the carbon footprint of this gathering was, but the reports of 12-hour deliberation sessions indicates that the representatives made the most of the opportunity to discuss face-to-face. The most recent report is comprised of hundreds of pages of reporting and analysis. A massive chunk of those pages is filled just with the citations. I'm not going to count them all, but I heard that there are 6,000 of them, and it seems like a pretty reasonable estimate. The citations are overwhelmingly scientific journal articles, but they also include compiled reports from organizations like the International Energy Agency and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, otherwise known as the OECD. And even some popular media-type publications like Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which is cited in Chapter 4. This special report was commissioned to explore the potential for limiting global mean surface temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, above what is commonly termed the pre-industrial temperatures. The reference temperature used in the report is the average global temperature measured between 1850 and 1900. The most commonly used number that has been cited as the point we should strive to limit warming to is 2 degrees Celsius, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But this number has been used with little scrutiny over the years. It was first proposed by an economist, William Nordhaus. Yes, the same William Nordhaus who received the Nobel Prize in Economics this year. Back in the 1970s, as little more than an educated guess at a good limit for avoiding severe consequences of climate change. Since then, the limit has found its way into a series of climate policies, most likely because of its simplicity and the fact that it could be seen as an ambitious but not impossible goal. Probably the most well-known agreement, the Paris Agreement from 2015, refers to 2 degrees Celsius, but also mentions striving for 1.5 degrees C. At the time, there was not enough literature exploring the effects of precisely 1.5 degrees C warming, so the policymakers held off on making it a written commitment. But there were many researchers and policymakers who were not satisfied with 2 degrees C, so they started looking seriously at 1.5 degrees, and thus 2018's IPCC Special Report was born. The report explores the latest research on the current state of the planet and the body of research that estimates the potential effects of a 1.5 degrees C warmer world and how we can get there. It is organized into 5 chapters. Firstly, where we are now in the context for the report. Secondly, pathways to limiting warming below 1.5 degrees C. Third, impacts of 1.5 degrees C warmer world. Fourth, practicalities of the global responses to mitigation and adaptation measures. And finally, some considerations for how we square these responses with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. I have not read the entire report, but I'm working through it. It's several hundred pages, and it's dense. But I would like to comment on a few bits that stood out to me. First off, I did read the full summary for policymakers, which is only 33 pages. It definitely reads like a bunch of scientists wrote it. It's dry, impersonal, devoid of adjectives, and quite objective. However, they are definitely selling the idea that 1.5 degrees C is the best target because there are some significant increases in risk between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. One important quote from Chapter 1 drives home a point that I was not convinced of, that the amount of warming that we've already locked in because of emissions up to this point is probably less than 1.5 degrees C. In other words, if we were to stop emitting all greenhouse gases right now, park all cars, ground all airplanes, shut down all fossil fuel power plants, and basically retreat back into our caves and go live off the land, the average global temperature would settle somewhere below 1.5 degrees. But it would be above 1 degree C because we got to 1 degree C last year in 2017. That's hopeful. At least it's still possible to keep from warming above 1.5 degrees C. I suppose that's why this report has even been written. But to think seriously about this, if we stop emitting all greenhouse gases right now, we'll still be in for warming between 1 degree and 1.5 degrees. That means that some of the things predicted could still happen, even if we magically transitioned instantaneously away from fossil fuels. Because the focus of this podcast is the discussion and the opinions around that discussion, I'm going to make the recap of what the report actually predicts as brief as possible, because I think the responses are more important. The IPCC predictions really haven't changed much over the years, just increases in certainty around their predictions. But what continues to shift is the political landscape amidst which this whole discussion exists. So here we go. I'm going to move fast. If you pick up something interesting to you, dig into it. I'll link to the original report in the description. Some key findings. First of all, the fact that global mean surface temperatures around planet Earth have risen about 1 degree over the past century, and that the overwhelming cause is human activity, has been described as, quote, virtually certain, unquote. Let's just put that part of the debate to rest right now. I'm taking most of what follows directly from Chapter 3, in which authors detail the effects of a world that has warmed about 1.5 to 2 degrees C by the end of the century. This does mean higher average temperatures in pretty much all land areas, and land temperatures will increase more than ocean temperatures. That is partly because the ocean is better at absorbing the excess heat from the air. Over the past half-century, the upper layer of the oceans, the top 700 meters, has gotten warmer just behind the rising air temperature. This has slowed the Gulf Stream, the regional current that keeps Europe warm. How much the oceans will continue to warm is hard to predict, but it will react more slowly than the atmosphere, so any effects will linger. Oceans also tend to absorb excess CO2, making them more acidic and less friendly to sea creatures, especially ones that grow shells. The biggest loser in all of this is perhaps the coral reefs. Even under the best case scenario, 90% of coral reefs could be bleached and die, taking the ecosystems that depend on the reefs with them. Precipitation is hard to predict, but the consensus seems to be that wet places will tend to get wetter and dry places will continue to get drier. However, the exact amounts are stated with little certainty. Arctic sea ice is expected to continue decreasing. In a 1.5 degrees C warmer world, that would mean 1 in 100 summers are completely ice-free. In a 2 degrees C warmer world, that increases to 1 in 10. And let's remember that our current trajectory has us headed toward 3 degrees. But in good news, there seems to be no lasting effect, so the ice caps will recover if we turn things around later and bring temperatures back down. Melting ice on land, primarily the Greenland ice sheet and West Antarctic ice sheet, is going to add some additional sea level rise. They estimate about 0.5 meter or about 18 inches. But the error bars are huge. This could be a lot less, but it also could be a lot more. The one certainty is that the change in mean sea level around the world is going to be in the upward direction. Coastal cities definitely will need to adapt, and they estimate that tens of millions of people will be put in danger. This rise is going to happen even if we decarbonize quickly. Crop and livestock production are likely to be affected, but exactly exactly how is hard to predict. The extra CO2 makes plants more productive, but that doesn't necessarily mean they provide more nutrients. And warming temperatures means soils are harder to maintain and livestock will be more stressed. Fisheries stand a high risk of lost catch, and wild stocks are likely to relocate. I've not come across any analysis of possible new farming locations opening up or becoming more productive. I'm thinking specifically of Canada and Russia. More heat waves, ozone pollution, and growing ranges for disease-carrying mosquitoes will put more human health at risk. But enough of the depressing details. I'll link to the report so you can dig deeper if you'd like. You've tuned into this podcast to hear about the debate, how people have been responding to the news. You heard a few responses from the media introduction. I wanted to pull responses from the skeptical camp as well, but they've been surprisingly quiet on the issue. Breitbart did publish an article with the intent of sowing doubt pertaining to the qualifications of the 91 scientists who authored this report, and the BBC got in some hot water for inviting a prolific climate change skeptic, Myron Ebell of the Competitive Enterprise Institute and former member of the EPA transition team for the Trump administration. Before I move on, I'd actually like to defend the decision of the BBC to have Ebell on their show. First of all, the moderator did an exceptional job of undermining Ebell's specious claims. It may have been a bit childish to bring on a representative of the Trump administration, mostly to make a fool of him, but to be fair, Ebell brings it on himself. I'll link to the interview. It's quite interesting. After listening to a bit of Ebell's rhetoric, I think I'm starting to see what the issue really is and why his messaging and that of other skeptical pundits has resonated so well with so many people. This is from his interview with the BBC on October 8th.
I've investigated the claims and I find them wanting from multiple viewpoints. One of them is that what they are proposing needs to be done will have much more deleterious effects on the planet and on humanity than the problem that they have identified.
After cutting Ebell short multiple times for trying to challenge the science, the BBC's Evan Davis challenged Ebell to present any evidence that the panel had been corrupted. Ebell spouts a few falsehoods about the character of the organization, and then goes into these figures about the cost of adaptation. The IPCC did in fact propose that the solution would cost trillions of dollars a year in investments in new technology. That's an enormous sum of money, but I think Ebell is making an assumption. If that amount of money is spent in the private sector, that means lots of jobs. But I think Ebell's discomfort with the figure is that governments will be doing the spending, either by increasing taxation or printing money, two things that are anathema to conservative views. Here's Ebell's voicing his concern on CNN last year.
Look, these people always try to take advantage of disasters to say what we need is more government and just listen to us.
And this is where I think we could be onto something. What responses there have been from the skeptic camp have had this common thread. An article by Stephen Hayward in the Powerline blog spends only a moment mocking the report and climate scientists before immediately picking up on a tweet by Eric Holthaus, a columnist for Slate and unabashed supporter of overthrowing the current world order. I'll link to his Twitter feed to back up that statement. Hayward uses the remainder of the blog entry to quote a lengthy passage from the IPCC report, which discusses possible legislative options that would encourage sustainable practice in the private sector, and then translates the paragraph as he understands it, which is, quote, "Decoded from that gobbledygook is a straightforward ratification of what I've always said. The solution for every environmental problem is always massively more government control of people and resources." End quote. This common return to the issue of what people propose we do about climate change makes a great deal of sense with the knowledge of a theory that was first introduced to me by former journalist Peter Hadfield. He uses the handle Potholer54 on YouTube. Here's his explanation from a video entitled A Conservative Solution to Global Warming, Part 1.
Margaret Thatcher never contradicted the science. What she criticized was the way climate change was being used by a few extremists as an excuse to attack the capitalist system. The problem is that in the United States, powerful lobby groups have taken this to mean that anyone who accepts the science must therefore be a member of this nutty anti-capitalist fringe group. Well, what Shapiro says next gives us a very revealing clue.
All of which is to say, if you could come up with a solution that did not hurt millions of people and plunge us back into the 1850s, then maybe we could talk about it.
So it's not really the science Ben has a problem with. It's his fear that those who accept the link between CO2 and global temperature have some sort of agenda and want to plunge us back to the 1850s. So he's only willing to accept the science if there's an acceptable solution.
I got to face this situation personally last week. As I've been trying to find climate change skeptics whom I can invite on the podcast, I found myself in the phone with a local business leader who had written an op-ed earlier this year that sure makes him sound like a veritable climate change denier. As soon as he knew the topic I wanted to ask him about, emotions bubbled up and an immense brick wall stood between us and a productive conversation. He proceeded to rant for the next several minutes about his past conversations with environmentalists, which he explained almost always devolved into ideological browbeating and childish name-calling. Indeed, our conversation never actually made it to the topic of climate change. It got stuck on the issue of whether or not government should force utilities to pay for more renewables. He was actually a fan of solar and wind, but he was afraid that the technologies were not yet ready to support the full electrical need of our city. Whether or not he accepts the scientific consensus on climate change, I never got to dig into. He knew that this issue was fraught with meaning far beyond simply reading thermometers. I'm still not sure if I convinced him that my intentions are not to shove liberal ideology down his throat, but I hope that you will be able to hear his side of the story one of these days. Of course, that's just one Colorado conservative's subjective experience and only one data point supporting Hadfield's theory. But this is exactly why I've started this endeavor. Are the conservatives who are unconvinced by climate science just unintelligent ideologues, unable to comprehend simple thermodynamics and risk mitigation because of a mental block they've erected to protect a precious and fragile theory of the world? By actually listening to what the skeptics have to say, I think we'll find that this is far too simplistic of an explanation. I believe that this business leader whom I spoke to is working off outdated information on the state of renewables. Who can blame him? I studied wind energy for a year, but when I saw the kinds of electricity prices my last company was bidding for new wind projects, my jaw literally dropped. The industry is changing unbelievably quickly, and if you're not staying on top of it, it's pretty reasonable to think that forcing our communities to build unproven technology could cause more problems than it solves. I am certainly convinced by the general consensus of climate scientists, but if I step back and take an objective view of the commentary surrounding the issue, I can start to see where the skeptics are coming from. If I may, of course I may, it's my podcast after all, I'd like to make an effort to understand the values of conservative-minded folks, to try to understand their perspective. If you don't consider yourself conservative, try to follow me, and imagine what it feels like to see the world in this way. If you are conservative, let me know if I've totally missed the mark. Conservatives are the kinds of folks who care deeply about liberty, and especially in the US, have a healthy fear of government overreach. These are people who often come from working-class backgrounds and understand what it's like to struggle to pay the utility bill each month. These are often people who are high in trait conscientiousness, meaning that they like to have things in order and to put them in order. Strong social systems and just competence hierarchies often fulfill this need for order when trying to understand the larger world. They are quick to recognize the benefits of society's collective knowledge and hesitant to challenge it. They are comforted by the stability of the present social order, and if they want to change it, they'd like to see changes to be incremental, transparent, and with popular consent. Many of these people grew up during, or listened carefully to their parents and grandparents who lived through, the global ideological struggles of capitalism versus socialistic communism or fascist Nazism. Ideas like economic growth and free markets have meant prosperity and liberty, while ideas like state power and revolution have been code words for tyrannical totalitarianism. If these lines do not describe your mental framework, do try to put yourself in those shoes for just a moment. And then imagine what you would feel when you read or hear statements like this. A dire new report reveals our capitalist economic system may not be up to the task of dealing with climate disasters to come, writes Business Insider. Climate change will make the next global crash the worst, writes The Guardian. To accurately diagnose the climate change problem, we have to get at the root, our economic system, write Diana Stewart and Ryan Gunderson. Even pulling directly from the IPCC report, Stewart and Gunderson write, states are the only actors that have the legitimacy and capacity to fund and organize large-scale transitions. And to return to that tweet that got Stephen Hayward up in arms, Eric Holthouse had written, if you were wondering what you can do about climate change, the world's top scientists just gave rigorous backing to systematically dismantle capitalism. Is it any wonder conservatives don't trust these people? Is it so unreasonable to think that conservatives would be extra critical of those pushing such an agenda? If we are going to have a reasonable conversation about climate change, we must all try to understand one another, because this problem is already affecting all of us. This attempt to understand the reluctance of climate change skeptics is in no way giving them a pass. Simply because you do not like the implications of the facts does not mean that you can ignore them. But this absolutely is a recognition that progressive fear-mongering is a real problem. Just because the issues we face take place on long timescales hard to comprehend does not give environmentalists the liberty to exaggerate the threat to gain attention. We must face this situation with the humility to accept the gaps in our knowledge, the courage to admit when we're wrong, the rationality to examine the solutions objectively, and the decency to show every contributor to the conversation due respect. This is an open invitation to anyone, left or right, progressive or conservative, climate justice warrior or climate change skeptic, to join the conversation. I would be honored to hear your thoughts, to learn your priorities and your fears, and to help add your voice to the conversation. In the next episode, we will hear from a man who seems to bridge the divide. He is a fiscal conservative, a classical liberal, a former Wall Street banker, and a tireless advocate of addressing climate change. I hope to have that audio out later this week or next, so stay tuned. My name is Jeffrey DeSena, and this is the Great Climate Debate Podcast. Thank you for listening.